If you had to create a Mount Rushmore of human history, and I don't just mean politics, presidents or generals, but the absolute giants of ideas, of religion, of culture, there's one face you'd almost have to chisel in first.
Mm-hmm.
Before you even get to the Greek philosophers or the Roman emperors, you have to deal with him. He's the lawgiver, the prophet, the man who supposedly split a sea in two, turned the Nile to blood, and carried stone tablets down from a burning mountain. We are, of course, talking about Moses.
It's genuinely hard to overstate his importance.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. I mean, whether you're looking at him through a purely historical lens, a theological one, or even just as a literary character, he's at this massive, massive intersection of civilizations.
Right.
You really can't understand the West or, frankly, the Middle East without grappling with the story of Moses. He's the central human figure of the Torah. He's a preeminent prophet in Islam. And, he's mentioned more by name in the Quran than anyone else.
More than Muhammad.
More than Muhammad, yes.
Mm.
And in Christianity, he's this constant prototype for Jesus. Not to mention he's a symbol of liberation for everyone, from the American pilgrims crossing the ocean to the civil rights movement marching on Washington. He is everywhere.
But that's the thing, isn't it? And this is, I think, the core of our deep dive today. When we think of Moses, most of us, and let's be totally honest here, we get this immediate picture of Charlton Heston.
Oh, absolutely. The Ten Commandments.
Exactly. The big gray beard, the flowing red robes, that dramatic staff, the wind machine blowing his hair just right. It's this very cinematic, very polished, technicolor version of the man. But when you start digging into the sources we've got for today, which are fascinating, by the way, you find the reality is so much murkier and honestly so much more interesting.
That is precisely it. We're trying to get behind the Hollywood iconography. It's powerful, sure, but it completely flattens the complexity of the figure. And our source stack today is really built to do that. We're pulling from these big, comprehensive encyclopedic histories, but also from some very specific theological commentary. We have Brevard Childs, who is just a giant in figuring out how these texts actually work, what they're trying to do.
And we have some archaeology, right?
Yes, and this is the really exciting stuff. We have some cutting-edge reports from the Biblical Archaeology Society that are zeroing in on what's called the Ramesside period in Egypt, which is, it's our prime suspect for the time of the Exodus.
Okay, so the mission for today is, it's pretty ambitious, we're asking. Can we actually find the historical Moses? Is he there in the dirt, in the papyrus fragments, in the pottery? And then how did this one man become the absolute blueprint for a prophet across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam?
It's a huge question.
And I also want to get into some of the weirder stuff. I mean, really weird. Like, why on earth did Michelangelo carve a statue of Moses with horns?
Mm-hmm.
And why did Benjamin Franklin, of all people, want Moses parting the Red Sea on the Great Seal of the United States?
It really is a detective story. It's a search for a man who is, like you said, everywhere in our culture, but who, so frustratingly, leaves almost no direct physical trace in the contemporary Egyptian record.
Yeah.
That's the core tension, right?
Right. Yeah.
The Moses of faith, who speaks to God face to face, versus the Moses of history, who is, he's like a ghost.
A ghost in the machine of history. I like that. Okay, so let's start this detective story at the very beginning with the name. Because even the name Moses is apparently a kind of identity crisis.
It really is.
So in the Bible, in Exodus, you have this incredibly famous scene. Pharaoh's daughter is by the Nile. She finds a baby in a basket in the reeds. She pulls him out, and she decides to name him Moses. And the text gives a reason, right? It says she calls him that because she drew him out of the water.
Right. And that's the classic, the biblical explanation. It's a form of folk etymology. In Hebrew, the verb to draw out is mashu. So the narrative directly links his name, Moshe, to this act of being drawn from the river. It's beautiful, it's poetic, it anchors his entire identity in that single moment of salvation.
But there's always a but with this stuff, isn't there?
There's a big but. If we're putting on our historian or linguist hats, that explanation has a significant problem.
Let me guess. Pharaoh's daughter is, she's Egyptian. She's not likely to be fluent in Hebrew, and she certainly wouldn't name a baby she's adopting into the royal court using a foreign verb root, would she?
Exactly. It just doesn't pass the cultural sniff test. It would be like a Russian princess finding a baby and naming him pulled out in English. It doesn't make sense.
She would give him an Egyptian name.
So scholars looked elsewhere.
They did. And when you look at the Egyptian language of the time, the answer is, it's practically staring you in the face. There's an extremely common Egyptian root,
Yeah.
Memsi or Moose. Mos. Okay, that sounds really familiar from like high school history class.
It should. It just means child of or born of, and we see it everywhere in the names of the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom. Thutmose
Right.
means born of Thoth, the god of wisdom. Ramesses or Ramesses means born of Ra, the sun god. You have Tumos, born of Ta. It was a completely standard way of naming a noble child, connecting them directly to a patron deity.
So wait a second. If his name is just Moses or Moose and it means child of, is it like an unfinished sentence? Child of blank?
That is the leading theory among Egyptologists and biblical historians.
Hmm.
The idea is that Moses is very likely an abbreviated name. His full name was probably something like Ramos or Thutmose or Amenmose, a standard Egyptian theophoric name, a name that bears a god's name. And at some point, the divine part, the Egyptian god's name, was dropped.
Wow, that is incredibly symbolic. It's like he's shedding his Egyptian identity right there in his name. He's no longer the child of Ra. He's just the child, or maybe the child of no Egyptian god.
Precisely. It's a theological statement. It's a severance. By lopping off the prefix, he symbolically renounces his connection to the Egyptian pantheon. It's a rejection of his upbringing.
And the biblical author must have known this, right? They were probably playing with it.
Oh, absolutely. This is what's so clever about the text. While the Egyptian origin is almost certainly the historical one, the Hebrew text engages in this brilliant wordplay, a pun with a purpose. You see, the Hebrew word Moshe, it's an active participle.
What does that mean exactly? An active participle.
It means it describes someone doing the action, not having the action done to them. So Moshe doesn't actually mean the one who was drawn out. In Hebrew, that would be a passive form, something like Nimsheh. Moshe means the one who draws out.
Oh, I see it now. So the text is doing this subtle bit of foreshadowing. He's not just the baby who was saved from the river. His name itself prophesies that he's going to be the one who draws his people out of Egypt.
Exactly right. It's a pun that defines his destiny. It takes what was probably a common Egyptian name, reinterprets it through a Hebrew lens, and turns it into a mission statement. It's an incredible piece of literary and theological engineering.
Okay, so speaking of that baby, the basket, the river, it feels like such a unique, one-of-a-kind story. But it turns out Moses wasn't the first ancient hero to get a start like that.
No, not by a long shot. This is a classic literary motif, what scholars call the humble origins trope, or the exposed infant motif. He shows up in a lot of ancient Near Eastern myths. And the most striking parallel, one that predates the biblical text by centuries, is the legend of Sargon of Akkad.
Sargon of Akkad, remind us who he was.
He was a major Mesopotamian ruler way back in the 23rd century B.C.E. He founded the Akkadian Empire, which was really one of the first true empires in world history. But the legend of his birth, which we have preserved on cuneiform tablets, is, well, it's almost a carbon copy of the Moses story.
Really? How close are we talking?
It's startlingly close. The legend says his mother was a high priestess who conceived him in secret. She couldn't keep the baby, so she put him in a basket of rushes.
A basket of rushes.
Sealed the lid with bitumen, that's pitch or tar,
Sealed with pitch.
and cast him into the river.
That is just, it's the same story. The rushes, the pitch, the river, all the key elements are there.
They are. The river carries Sargon down to a man named Akkad, a drawer of water, who finds him and adopts him. And of course, from these humble beginnings, Sargon rises up to become the great king.
So what's the purpose of a story like that in the ancient world? Is it to legitimize the ruler?
That's exactly it. It's a way of explaining how someone who is an outsider, someone without a clear royal lineage, rises to the highest levels of power. It basically says, this person was marked for greatness from birth. The gods themselves protected this child from death. It's a big, flashing literary sign that says, pay attention. This is a man of destiny.
So the biblical writers are using this well-known trope to signal to their audience that Moses is on that same level as a Sargon.
Correct. It's a literary flag. But the biblical narrative, as it always does, adds its own unique and ironic twist. Moses isn't just some random outsider who becomes king. He is a Hebrew, raised in the very house of the man, trying to exterminate his people.
The ultimate irony.
It is. The text is careful to give us his family tree, his parents, Amram and Jochebed, his siblings, Miriam and Aaron. He has a real family. And the irony is just dripping from the page. The Pharaoh issues a decree to kill all the Hebrew male infants, and yet he ends up paying for the food, the clothing, and the elite education of the very man who will bring his empire to its knees.
It's like a Trojan horse story, but the horse is a baby in a basket floating down the Nile.
That's a perfect way to put it. From a theological perspective, it highlights the You could say the incompetence of evil. The oppressor literally funds his own destruction without even knowing it.
Okay, let's pivot now to the investigation. The detective story, as you called it. We have this enormous detailed narrative in the Bible. But when we turn to the Egyptian records, and the Egyptians were obsessive record keepers, right? They wrote everything down.
Meticulous.
So what do we find in all their hieroglyphs and papyri about Moses, about the Exodus?
In a single word, silence.
Silence.
Complete and total silence. There's not one single direct mention of a man named Moses in any contemporary Egyptian text we've ever found. There is no record of a massive population of, allegedly 2 million enslaved Israelites leaving the country overnight. There's no court record of the 10 plagues systematically destroying the land, the crops, and the people. Nothing.
Okay, so this is where the skeptics have a field day, I imagine.
This is their starting point, yes. And you have major figures in biblical archaeology, people like William G. Dever, who have argued for decades that the consensus among modern archaeologists is that the biblical Moses, as he's described on this epic scale, is largely a mythical figure.
Do they think he's just made up?
Not necessarily entirely made up. Dever, for example, suggests that maybe there was a Moses-like figure, some kind of charismatic leader of a smaller group in the Transjordan, whose story got magnified over centuries. But the grand narrative, 2 million people wandering the Sinai Desert for 40 years, it just doesn't fit the archaeological footprint. I mean, if that many people and their livestock were in the Sinai for that long, we'd expect to find something.
Pottery shards, campsites, graves.
Anything. And we find almost nothing from that specific era that we can definitively link to them. So the lack of evidence is a huge problem.
But I have to push back on that a little. You say the Egyptians were record keepers, but were they honest record keepers? Or were they propaganda artists? I mean, seriously, if your entire country was just wrecked by a foreign god and your whole slave labor force just walked out the door, are you going to carve that story onto a monument for eternity?
And that is the crucial counter-argument. It's a very, very valid point. Ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions were not history in our modern objective sense. They were, for all intents and purposes, propaganda. They were a pharaoh's resume, meant to be read by the gods and future generations. You recorded your victories. You recorded your triumphs. You recorded how you maintained Ma'at.
Ma'at. That's the Egyptian concept of cosmic order and truth, right?
Exactly. The pharaoh's primary job was to maintain Ma'at. To admit that some foreign god of slaves came in and totally dismantled that order plagues, death of the firstborn, a successful slave revolt, that would be a catastrophic admission of failure. It would be an announcement that the pharaoh had failed in his most essential duty. So no, you wouldn't record that. The absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence.
And there's another point, too. Nations don't usually invent histories of being slaves, do they?
That's the other side of the coin. It's a powerful argument. Most national origin stories are heroic. We are descended from gods, or we are descended from great kings. To build your entire national identity around the memory of being powerless, mud brick-making slaves, that suggests a kernel of genuine historical trauma. Narratives of humiliation usually have some truth to them.
Okay, so if we assume there is a kernel of history there, the next question is when, because I know this is a huge debate. When would this have happened?
Right. This is the great dating debate. For a long time, there was a theory, based on a very literal reading of a verse in 1 Kings, that the Exodus happened in the 15th century B.C.E.
And what's the problem with that?
Well, the archaeology in Canaan from that period just doesn't show the kinds of destruction layers or population shifts that you'd expect from a large-scale conquest or settlement. The evidence just isn't there. But the archaeology points much more strongly to the 13th century B.C.E.
The Ramesside period.
The Ramesside period. The time of the great pharaohs, especially Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great.
And is there a smoking gun for the 13th century theory?
There is something that is about as close to a smoking gun as you're ever going to get in this field. And it comes down to place games. The book of Exodus says that the enslaved Israelites were forced to build store cities for Pharaoh, and it gives us two names, Pithom and Ramses.
Okay, so we have names.
We have names. And archaeologists have been able to identify the Egyptian equivalents. The city of Ramses is Ramesses, the great northern capital built by Ramses II. Pithom is likely the site of Pi-Adam. Now here is the absolutely crucial detail.
I'm listening.
These two cities, under these specific names, were only flourishing and important together during the Ramesside period, basically the 13th down to the 11th centuries BCE.
Why is that so important?
Because after that period, Pi-Ramesses was abandoned. The branch of the Nile that supplied it with water silted up, and the city died. The pharaohs of the next dynasty physically dismantled the city, stone by stone, and moved the monuments to build their new capital, a city called Panis. The name Pyramès literally vanished from the map. It became a ghost town.
So, if you were a biblical writer making this story up from scratch, hundreds of years later, say in the 7th or 6th century, you wouldn't have known the name Pyramès.
You almost certainly would not have. You would have used the name of the great northern capital that was prominent in your own time, like Tanis or Sais. It would be like writing a historical novel about colonial America today and having the characters talk about going to New Amsterdam.
Or to New York.
Exactly. If you use the name New Amsterdam, it proves that your story is preserving a genuine memory from a specific earlier time. The fact that the biblical text preserves the name Ramesses strongly suggests that the tradition, the memory it's based on, actually dates back to that 13th century window when the city was alive. It anchors the story in a very specific historical geography.
That's a powerful piece of evidence. It's like a geographical fingerprint.
It is, and there's more. The Bible talks about the sea crossing at the Yam Suf. Now, we almost always translate that as Red Sea.
Right, the parting of the Red Sea.
But that translation actually comes to us from the later Greek version of the Bible, the Septuagint. In the original Hebrew, Yam Suf literally means Sea of Reeds.
The Reed Sea. So not the big open ocean we see in the movies.
No, not at all. And this corresponds perfectly with an Egyptian term, pachuf, which also means reedy marsh or papyrus marsh. It referred to the marshy, reed-filled lakes in the northeastern Nile Delta, which is exactly where the city of Pyramès was located. So again, the geography described in the text fits the landscape of the 13th century B.C.E. perfectly. It's a world of wetlands and shallow lakes, not the deep water of the Gulf of Suez.
Okay, so the geography and the timeline seem to point to the 13th century. But have we actually found any evidence of Israelites or people who look like proto-Israelites living there at that time?
This is where we get into some really intriguing, if small, discoveries. One of the reports from the Biblical Archaeology Society highlights a find in Western Thebes, way down south, near the mortuary temple of Aya and Horemheb. Archaeologists there excavated a simple worker's house.
Just one house. That sounds pretty small scale.
It is. But it's the type of house that's so important. In archaeology, architecture can be a kind of ethnic marker. And this house was a four-room house.
Okay, what's a four-room house?
The four-room house is the absolute quintessential Israelite architectural style. We find them all over the hill country of Canaan during the Iron Age, when Israel is emerging. It's a very distinctive layout, a central courtyard space flanked by 3 adjoining rooms. It's thought to be designed for a specific kind of family structure, maybe involving keeping some animals inside and certain purity laws. It's an Israelite fingerprint in stone.
And they found one in Egypt.
They found one in Egypt, but here's the twist. In Canaan, where stone is abundant, they built these houses out of stone. The one in Egypt, however, was built of wattle and daub, that's basically sticks and mud, which was the common building material for non-monumental buildings in Egypt.
So it's like a hybrid?
It's a hybrid. It suggests that the people living there were carrying their cultural blueprint, their architectural DNA, if you will, but adapting it to the local materials. They were maintaining their distinct identity while living and working in a foreign land.
So we have potential proto-Israelites working as builders in Egypt.
Exactly. Working as demolishers and builders, probably for the pharaohs. It's a tiny little puzzle piece, but it's a significant one. And we also have a document called the Onomasticon of Meneptah.
The what now?
The Onomasticon of Meneptah. It's a kind of ancient encyclopedia, a long list of names and places compiled by a scribe. And in this list, it mentions a place in the Delta region called the Lakes of Pithom. But the fascinating thing is that it uses a Semitic word for lake, B-R-K-T, which is related to the Hebrew Bereka, instead of the native Egyptian word.
So a Hebrew or Semitic word had crept into the official Egyptian maps.
It had. It suggests that there was a Semitic-speaking population living in that specific area for long enough and in large enough numbers to actually influence the local place names. The linguistic footprint is there, even if the grand monuments aren't.
Okay, and all of this is leading up to the Merneptah Stele, right? I feel like this is the big one.
This is the cornerstone. This is the one piece of evidence that is undisputed. Merneptah was the son and successor of Ramesses II. Around the year 1219 B.C.E., he erected a massive granite slab of victory stele to brag about his military campaigns.
As pharaohs do.
As pharaohs do. He lists all the enemies he crushed in a campaign into Canaan. He named cities like Ashkelon, Gezer, Yenoam, And then he has this line, Israel is laid waste, its seed is not.
Israel is laid waste. So he's claiming he wiped them out.
It's standard military hyperbole. But what's so important is that it is the earliest definitive extra-biblical mention of the name Israel anywhere in history. But it's not just the name, it's the hieroglyphics used to write it.
What's special about them?
In Egyptian hieroglyphics, scribes use something called a determinative. It's a silent symbol at the end of a word that tells you what category that word belongs to. For the words Ashkelon and Gezer, the scribe used the determinative for a city-state or a foreign town. It's a little symbol of a throwing stick over 3 hills.
Okay.
But for the word Israel, he used a different determinative. He used the symbol for a people or a tribal group, a seated man and woman with a plural marker.
So Israel wasn't a city, it was a people group.
Exactly. By the year 1219 B.C.E., there was a distinct group of people in Canaan called Israel. They were significant enough for the Pharaoh of Egypt to brag about defeating them in battle. And they were identified as a people, not yet as a settled, walled nation-state. This fits perfectly with the biblical picture of Israel just beginning to settle in the land.
So it means the Exodus, if it happened, has to be before that date. It tightens the timeline.
It tightens it considerably. You can't have an Exodus in 1200 if the people are already established in Canaan in 1219. It really pushes the likely date for an Exodus event back into the long reign of Ramesses II in the mid-13th century. It all lines up.
This is incredible detective work. But I want to switch gears a bit. We have the biblical story, and we have this official silence from the Egyptian records of the time. But eventually, the Egyptians did have something to say, didn't they? I read about these anti-Moses stories in our source stack, and they sound absolutely wild.
They are completely fascinating. We have to fast forward in time quite a bit to the Hellenistic period, around the 3rd century B.C.E. An Egyptian priest and historian named Manetho wrote a history of Egypt. He was writing in Greek for the new Ptolemaic rulers, and he includes this story that is pretty clearly a garbled and hostile version of the Exodus.
Hostile?
Well, for starters, in Manetho's version, the leader of this group isn't a Hebrew prophet. He's a renegade Egyptian priest from the city of Heliopolis, and his name is Osarseph. And he's not leading a holy nation out of bondage. He becomes the leader of a colony of lepers and other unclean people.
A leper colony. That's a very different spin.
It's a very different spin. The story goes that the Pharaoh had quarantined all these ritually and physically impure people in the stone quarries to work as slave labor. And this priest, Osarseph, who Manetho later explicitly says changed his name to Moses, organizes them into a rebellion.
Okay, so it's a rebellion story.
It is, but it's framed as a complete inversion of all Egyptian values. Osarseph creates a new set of laws for his followers that are basically an anti-religion. He forbids the worship of the Egyptian gods. He commands his people to kill and eat the sacred animals, the bulls, the rams, the cats that were revered in Egypt.
So it's a deliberate desecration. It sounds like a funhouse mirror version of the 10 Commandments and the kosher laws.
That's a great way to describe it. It's the Exodus story told from the perspective of a horrified Egyptian traditionalist. And to make it worse, Manetho says these lepers then invited Egypt's old enemies, the Hyksos, back into the country to help them rule. And together, they terrorized Egypt for 13 years before a new pharaoh rose up and drove them all out for good.
It's a pure polemic, then. It's reframing the story.
It's 100% a polemic. It's Egyptian culture, centuries later, trying to process this memory of a group that left and rejected their entire way of life. But they frame it not as a liberation of a proud people, but as the expulsion of a disease. You didn't quit, you were fired.
We didn't lose our slaves, we purged a plague.
Exactly that. It's a fascinating example of how history can be rewritten by the side that perceives itself as the victim to save face.
And speaking of alternative interpretations, we can't really skip over Sigmund Freud, can we? He waded into this with his book Moses and Monotheism.
Oh yes. Freud's theory is, well, it's a journey. It's a very controversial book, his last major work, written while he was literally fleeing the Nazis. And he takes this idea of Moses being an Egyptian and runs with it in a very Freudian direction. He argued that Moses wasn't just any Egyptian, he was a nobleman, a high-ranking follower of the pharaoh Akhenaten.
Akhenaten, he's the famous heretic king, the one who tried to invent monotheism.
That's the one. Back in the 14th century BCE, a century before Ramesses, Akhenaten threw out the entire Egyptian pantheon and decreed that only one god could be worshipped. The Aten, the physical disk of the sun. It was a massive religious revolution, and it completely collapsed the moment he died. The old priesthoods wiped it from history.
So Freud's idea was that Moses was trying to keep that monotheistic flame alive.
That was his theory. He speculated that after Akhenaten's project failed, this Egyptian nobleman, Moses, found a group of Semitic slaves who were living in Egypt and essentially imposed this monotheistic religion on them. But, and here comes the deeply Freudian twist, Freud claimed that the Israelites, being a stiff-necked people, eventually got fed up with this demanding, abstract religion, and they murdered Moses in the wilderness.
They murdered him?
That was Freud's postulation. And he argued that the collective repressed guilt of this patricide of killing the father figure became the central trauma that shaped the entire subsequent development of Judaism, with its focus on law, sin, and atonement. The religion was, in his view, a giant coping mechanism for the guilt of killing its own founder.
Wow. Okay.
Yep.
What do actual historians make of that theory?
They generally reject it as pure speculation and pseudo-history. I mean, there is absolutely zero historical evidence for the murder of Moses. But the book is fascinating because it shows how Moses is this magnet for profound speculation. We are so compelled to understand who he was that even the father of psychoanalysis felt he had to put Moses on the couch, so to speak. It shows that Moses isn't just a historical puzzle, he's a deep psychological one, too.
Okay, let's step away from the psychoanalysis and the anti-narratives for a minute and turn to the text that we actually have, the canonical Moses. You mentioned the scholar Brevard Childs in our source stack. His approach is different, isn't it? He's not trying to dig for evidence in the Sinai. He's looking at the shape and purpose of the story itself.
That's right. Brevard Childs was a towering figure in biblical theology, taught at Yale for many years. His big contribution was what he called canonical criticism.
He argued that while it's interesting to try and figure out the different sources that were woven together to create the Torah, the J source, the E source, the P source.
The documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis, yes. Child said that's all well and good, but the most important thing is to look at the final form of the text, the canonical shape. He argued that the ancient editors who put all these sources together weren't just careless scrapbookers. They were brilliant theologians who were intentionally shaping the narrative to teach something profound about God and the covenant.
So when we read the book of Exodus, we shouldn't just be asking, did this literally happen exactly this way? We should be asking, what is this story as it's presented trying to teach its readers?
That's the heart of it. Let's take the burning bush scene. Historically, who knows? Maybe it was a particular type of acacia tree that looks like it's on fire when it blooms. Maybe it was a vision. But theologically, Child would say, look at what's happening. This is the moment of the revelation of the divine name, YHWH.
I am who I am.
Or perhaps better, I will be what I will be. It's a name that implies a God who is active, who is present, but who cannot be controlled or defined by human categories. It fundamentally changes the relationship between humanity and the divine from that moment on. That's the theological point of the story.
Or the 10 plagues. It's not just a series of random disasters.
Not at all. From a canonical perspective, the plagues are structured as a systematic dismantling of the Egyptian pantheon. It's a theological showdown. Each plague is a direct assault on the domain of a specific Egyptian deity.
So the Nile turning to blood.
That's an attack on Hapi, the god of the Nile's inundation. The plague of darkness. That's a direct humiliation of Ra, the great sun god, the most powerful god in Egypt. The death of the livestock. An attack on deities like Hathor, the cow goddess. It's a polemical story demonstrating that the god of slaves is more powerful than all the gods of the empire combined.
And Moses is the one orchestrating this. He's God's general in this war. But the text is always reminding us that he's a reluctant general, isn't he? He argues with God. He says he has a speech impediment. He's afraid.
That's absolutely key to his canonical portrait. On the one hand, he's the singular lawgiver. The text says he speaks to God panem el panem, face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. That's a level of intimacy no other prophet has. But the text constantly preserves his flaws, his humanity, his struggles with the very people he's leading. And the ultimate example of that is the golden calf incident.
Right. The moment he's up on Mount Sinai receiving the law and he comes down to find the people are already worshiping a golden idol.
It's the ultimate betrayal. He's literally holding the blueprint for a new holy society in his hands, and down in the valley, they've already reverted to paganism. And his reaction is so human. He flies into a rage and he smashes the stone tablets. He shatters the law before he's even delivered it.
But then he goes back up the mountain.
That's the critical part. He doesn't just condemn them and walk away. He goes back up and he intercedes for them. He argues with God on their behalf. He says, now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of the book that you have written. He's willing to sacrifice his own eternal life for the people who just betrayed him. That, right there, is the biblical definition of a prophet. someone who stands in the gap between the righteous anger of God and the sinfulness of the people.
And then there's the end of his life. The death of Moses in Deuteronomy 34. I've always found that part of the story to be just incredibly poignant.
It's one of the most moving passages in the entire Bible. Moses is 120 years old, but the text makes a point of saying his eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. He's still strong, he climbs Mount Nebo, and God shows him the entire promised land laid out before him, the goal of his entire life's struggle.
But he can't go in.
God says, I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. After everything, the plagues, the sea, the desert, 40 years of putting up with complaints and rebellion, he doesn't get to cross the finish line himself.
It seems so harsh.
It does, but it's theologically profound. It underscores the idea that the promise is always bigger than any single leader. The mission continues even when the man does not. He dies there in the land of Moab. And then the text adds this deeply mysterious final detail. And no one knows the place of his burial to this day. He leaves no shrine, no monument, no place for pilgrimage. He just vanishes into the landscape and into the memory of God.
We're definitely going to come back to that unknown grave in the outro because I think there's so much to unpack there. But first, Moses isn't just a figure in Judaism. He's this massive presence across the religious spectrum. How do Christianity and Islam see him?
Well, in Christianity, Moses is understood primarily through the lens of typology. He's seen as a type or a prefigurement of Jesus.
A type, as in a prototype or a foreshadowing?
Exactly. The New Testament writers are constantly drawing these direct parallels. Pharaoh tries to kill all the male infants in Egypt. King Herod tries to kill all the male infants in Bethlehem. Moses flees from the authorities. Jesus' family flows to Egypt.
Moses gives the law on Mount Sinai.
And Jesus gives the new law in the Sermon on the Mount. Moses lifts up a bronze serpent on a pole in the wilderness to heal the people from snake bites. The Gospel of John says the Son of Man must be lifted up on the cross to save humanity. It's a constant pattern of fulfillment.
And he even makes a literal appearance in the New Testament, doesn't he, at the Transfiguration?
Yes, on the Mount of Transfiguration. The inner circle of disciples, Peter, James, and John, see Jesus speaking with two figures from the past, Moses and Elijah. In Jewish tradition, Moses represents the law, the Torah, and Elijah represents the prophets. Their appearance alongside Jesus is meant to validate him as the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. So for Christians, you really can't understand the story of Jesus without first understanding the story of Moses. He builds the foundation.
And what about in Islam? It was shocking to me to read that he's mentioned more often in the Quran than Muhammad himself.
By a significant margin. He is known as Musa, and his story is told in great detail, scattered across many chapters, or surahs. In Islam, he holds the title of Rasul, which means a messenger who brings a revealed book, in his case, the Torah, and a specific law for his people. In that sense, he is a perfect parallel for Muhammad. Both were prophets, both were lawgivers, both were political leaders, and both had to lead their communities through periods of intense opposition and rejection.
Are there notable differences in the Quranic telling of his story?
There are some really fascinating new details and shifts in emphasis. For instance, in the Quran, the person who finds the baby Musa in the river is not Pharaoh's daughter, but Pharaoh's wife, a woman named Asiya. And she's portrayed as a secret believer in God, a righteous woman trapped in the house of a tyrant. She becomes a model of faith for all Muslims.
Oh, that's a huge difference.
It is. And there's also a mysterious and beautiful story in the Quran in Surah Al-Kahf, where Moses encounters a figure often identified by commentators as Khidr, a kind of mystic guide who possesses a different kind of knowledge from God.
And in the story, Moses is the student, right?
He is the student, yes. Moses, who is so used to being the one with the direct line to God, asks to follow Khidr to learn from him. Khidr agrees, but warns him, "You will not be able to have patience with me." And then Khidr proceeds to do three things that seem outrageous from a human perspective. He scuttles a boat belonging to some poor fisherman, he kills a young boy, and he repairs a collapsing wall in a town that just refused them food and water.
And Moses, I assume, objects to all of this.
He does. Every single time Moses says, "Why did you do that? That's unjust. That's wrong." He can't understand it. Finally, Khidr explains the hidden divine wisdom behind each act. The boat was about to be seized by a pirate king, so damaging it slightly actually saved it for its owners. The young boy was destined to grow into a tyrant who would torment his righteous parents. And beneath the wall was a hidden treasure that belonged to two young orphans, which Khidr was protecting for them. It's a profound lesson for Moses about the limits of human reason and the vastness of God's hidden wisdom.
It's a side of him you really don't see in the biblical narrative. The prophet as a humble student.
Exactly. And there's one more famous story from the tradition of the Isra and Miraj, the night journey. Muhammad ascends through the 7 heavens and meets the prophets who came before him. When he meets Moses, Moses gives him some very practical advice.
What kind of advice?
Well, God initially commands Muhammad that the Muslim community must perform 50 prayers a day. On his way back down, Muhammad passes Moses, who asks him what God commanded. When he hears 50, Moses basically says, "Go back. That's too many. I led the Israelites. I know people. They won't do it. Negotiate."
He's speaking from 40 years of experience in the desert.
He absolutely is. So Muhammad goes back and forth, with Moses coaching him, until the number of daily prayers is whittled down to 5.
Oh.
So in Islamic tradition, Moses is directly responsible for shaping one of the 5 pillars of the faith. He's the wise elder statesman, helping the new prophet carry the burden of leadership.
That's amazing. Trust me, I've dealt with humanity. You have to grade on a curve.
Essentially, yes.
Okay, we are definitely in the home stretch now. We've done the history, the anti-history, the theology across 3 faiths. I want to talk about the cultural legacy. And I have to start with the horns. We've all seen Michelangelo's famous statue of Moses. He's magnificent. He looks like a Greek god. He has this epic beard, and he has 2 little horns sticking out of the top of his head. Why?
This is one of the most famous translation errors in all of history. It all comes down to one Hebrew word in Exodus chapter 34. The word is Karen.
Karen.
The Hebrew text describes Moses coming down from Mount Sinai after receiving the 2nd set of tablets, and it says the skin of his face was Karen. Now, the Hebrew root KRN has a double meaning. As a noun, it means horn, like the horn of an animal. But as a verb, it means to send out rays or to radiate light. So the original Hebrew almost certainly means his face was radiant or shining with the reflected glory of God.
That makes a lot more sense. He was glowing.
He was glowing. However, when St. Jerome was translating the Hebrew Bible into Latin in the 4th century CE, a version that would become known as the Vulgate and would be the standard Bible for Western Christianity for over 1,000 years, he had a choice to make. And he chose the more literal physical meaning. He translated Charon as cornutum, which means horned.
Oh, no.
So for the next millennium, the official Bible of the Western Church said that Moses came down the mountain with a horned face. And artists like Michelangelo, being faithful readers of the text they had, sculpted and painted him with horns. It wasn't until the Renaissance and the Reformation, when scholars went back to the original Hebrew, that the error was widely corrected. But by then, the image was locked in, a mistranslation carved in marble.
That's incredible. But his legacy isn't just a quirky artistic one, it's deeply political, especially in America. I was really surprised by how obsessed the Founding Fathers were with the figure of Moses.
It makes perfect sense when you consider their own self-perception. The Pilgrims and the Puritans who first came to America saw themselves as the new Israel. They had fled the Egypt as a corrupt Europe, with its monarchies and religious persecution. They had crossed their own Red Sea in the form of the Atlantic Ocean, and they were entering the promised land of the New World to build a new society. The parallel was second nature to them.
And Benjamin Franklin wanted to put that right on the money, basically.
He wanted it on the Great Seal of the United States. In 1776, when the committee was formed to design the seal, Franklin's proposal was the dramatic image of Moses standing on the shore, staff raised, as the waters of the Red Sea crashed down on the Pharaoh and his chariots. And the proposed motto was, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God."
That is a very revolutionary Moses.
A very American Moses. Thomas Jefferson also proposed a similar image of the Israelites following the pillar of fire and cloud through the wilderness. George Washington was constantly eulogized as the American Moses, who led his people out of bondage to the British Pharaoh. But that symbolism didn't stop with the founders. It was picked up, arguably even more powerfully, by the abolitionist and civil rights movements.
Harriet Tubman.
She was known as Moses. The name was a title of honor. Why? Because she didn't just escape slavery herself. She kept going back into the Egypt of the South to lead more of her people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. The spirituals, songs like "Go Down Moses," were both expressions of hope and coded messages for escape.
And then Martin Luther King Jr.
He invoked the imagery in the most powerful way imaginable the night before he was killed.
The "I've been to the mountaintop" speech.
That's the one. In Memphis, Tennessee, the night before his assassination, he gave that prophetic speech. He talked about the struggle, and he ended by saying, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." He was explicitly casting himself in the role of Moses on Mount Nebo, seeing the future victory, knowing he personally wouldn't live to enter it. It's a testament to the enduring power of this story that it can frame the national experience of pilgrims, revolutionaries, and civil rights leaders. It is the ultimate script for liberation.
It truly is. So let's try to bring this all together. We started with a baby in a basket and an Egyptian name. We've moved through wattle and daub houses in Thebes, stories of leper colonies, golden calves, and we've ended up with Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis. What's the big takeaway from this deep dive?
I think for me, the takeaway is about the nature of historical impact itself. Whether we can ever definitively prove every single detail of the Exodus story is almost beside the point now. The figure of Moses, the story of Moses created this vacuum that history and culture had to fill. His absence in some ways would be more inexplicable than his presence.
A Moses-shaped hole in history.
That's it, exactly. Something happened. A group of Semitic people did somehow escape from the superpower of the day. A new radical form of law was given. A revolutionary monotheistic religion was formed. It's very difficult to explain that chain of reaction without some kind of powerful catalyst at the beginning. Moses is the name we give to that catalyst.
Which brings me back to that final provocation, the one we said we'd come back to. That unknown grave. The text is so emphatic. No one knows the place of his burial to this day. Why is that detail so important? Why does the story have to end with him just disappearing?
I think it gets to the very core of the Mosaic message. Think about it. If we knew where Moses was buried, what would be there today? There would be a shrine, a grand tomb, a temple. People would make pilgrimages there. And over time, they might start to worship the man himself.
They'd worship the messenger instead of the message?
Precisely. By deliberately erasing his physical resting place, the text forces all the focus back onto what he delivered. The law and the relationship with the one, unseen deity. Moses, the man, has to become secondary. He has to dissolve so that the covenant can remain primary. He's the ultimate medium for the message. And for the message to survive, the medium have to vanish.
That's a really powerful idea. And it's also a reminder of what we've seen throughout this whole conversation, the fluidity of memory. Depending on who you ask, Moses is a Hebrew rebel, an Egyptian priest, a military general, a perfect saint, a flawed leader. He changes to fit the needs of every generation that tells his story.
He becomes a mirror for our own struggles, for liberation, for our own search for law and meaning in a chaotic world.
So here's our final thought for you, the listener, to take away. We talked about that little four-room house found in Egypt, that small, almost insignificant architectural detail that hints at a much bigger story of cultural identity and survival. So maybe take a look at the four-room houses in your own history, in your own life. What are the small details, the seemingly minor family stories, the traditions, the turns of phrase that might seem insignificant, but which actually reveal the biggest truths about who you are and where you come from?
Because sometimes the most colossal historical truths aren't found in giant monuments, but are hidden in the humblest places, just like a baby in a basket hidden in the reeds.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
My pleasure. It was great.
We'll see you next time.